Okay, before we start, I need to address the elephant in the room. I dyed my hair, and it's not like a subtle change either. It's like a full identity crisis. So if you spend the next 30 minutes trying to figure out what changed, that's it. Anyway, if you've been on social media lately, you've probably seen the tradwife trend. It's everywhere. Perfect kitchens, homemade bread, soft lighting, women talking about submission, traditional gender roles, and this idea of a slower, simpler, more natural life. And on the surface, it looks peaceful, almost aspirational, like a life that's been figured out. But the more I looked at it, the more I started to notice something strange, because it doesn't really show up as just a lifestyle. It shows up as a story, a very specific version of how life is supposed to look. And the more I paid attention to that story, the more I realized it wasn't just about gender roles or aesthetics. It was about something much bigger. It was about how we're being sold narratives about what a good life looks like, and what gets left out when those narratives become the default. And that's what I want to unpack today. And at its core, the tradwife trend promotes a very specific structure. The man is the provider, the woman stays home. She manages the household, raises children, and often emphasizes being submissive to her husband. And a lot of this content frames that structure as natural, traditional, and historically accurate, which is where things get complicated. Because what we're really looking at isn't just a lifestyle. It's a narrative about how life should look. And when you actually look at the history, that narrative starts to fall apart. And you know what? Instead of me trying to explain the history myself, I'm going to pass it on to my friend Lev from History's Greatest Idiots podcast and have him walk us through the history of gender roles.
Harvey, want anything special for your birthday?
Just a decent cup of coffee.
You're kidding.
I'm serious. Honey, your coffee's undrinkable.
It's pretty harsh.
If you've spent any time on social media lately, you've probably encountered the tradwife while she's either cooking something from scratch, acquiescing to her husband's aimless whims, or longing for the warm, loving embrace of noted couch enthusiast J.D. Vance. She wants you to know her happiness comes from submitting to her husband and staying out of the family finances. Proponents of the tradwife aesthetic/cult will tell you this is a return to the natural order of things, that this is simply how it's always been, that the nuclear family, where the man earns, the woman bakes, and nobody asks any goddamn questions, is the baseline of human civilization. The problem is, though, it isn't. It genuinely, demonstrably isn't. So let's go back through the stinking, blood-spattered halls of ancient history to find out what traditional gender roles actually looked like.
Bearings Inspector.
She's a good one, too. Just look at that record.
Okay, now, Walt, you've had your little joke. Give her to somebody else. I ask for a man.
In ancient Mesopotamia, you know, that part of the world most Americans can now identify by turning on the news to get their daily dose of real-life horror, there are some of the earliest written records of commerce we have, such as clay tablets, and the occasional actual surviving document that isn't a complaint about a male shop owner treating his servants like absolute shit. These documents are full of women. Assyrian merchant women were managing businesses, producing textiles, signing contracts, acting as creditors, and writing letters chasing up payment. This is 4,000 years ago. Ancient Egypt is even more striking. Egyptian women could own property, inherit land, run businesses, and take disputes to court. Hatshepsut ruled as pharaoh for over 20 years and built monuments still standing today. Cleopatra, depending on who you talk to, spoke either 8 or 9 languages and ran foreign policy for one of the most powerful kingdoms on earth. The idea that women have always been passive domestic figures is not part of ancient wisdom. Ancient history is full of women who owned things, argued in court, ran empires, and occasionally thirst-trapped powerful Romans.
I pushed the button on the Xerox 914.
Jump forward to medieval Europe, women worked as brewsters, the primary producers of ale, a common and very necessary dietary staple, because the drinking water would kill you in the slowest and most stinky way possible. They ran market stalls, managed estates, and kept communities running while their husbands were away at war, dying for some nobleman who ploughed through more pheasant meat than the tyres of a Range Rover. The legal category of femme sole in English common law recognised unmarried women and widows as fully independent economic and legal actors. The erosion of women's economic participation didn't come from ancient tradition. It happened as guilds became more restrictive and the idea of separate domestic and public spheres got repackaged as natural law. It wasn't natural, it was a policy decision.
Polyglass means more than mileage when your wife has to drive alone.
Before industrialization, the home was a workplace. Everyone worked. Men, women, children, even the dead were put to work by being fodder for grave robbers. They worked on farms, in cottage industries, and in numerous different trades. When industrialization moved labor into factories, middle and upper class families started using female domesticity as a status symbol. If your wife didn't work, you were doing well enough to keep her home. The idle wife became a trophy. That ideal was then sold back as the natural order of femininity. The Victorian woman was a domestic angel who was pure, submissive, and probably addicted to laudanum. She was a very recent invention and a class aspiration. Working class women kept working, in factories, in fields, in domestic service. The fantasy was only available to upper class women.
AIDS diet plan helped me lose 28 pounds.
AIDS helps control your appetite so you lose weight. Yet AIDS lets you taste, chew, and enjoy. And the appetite suppressant in AIDS is not a stimulant.
The post-war American family is the direct ancestor of the tradwife aesthetic, and it's worth noting it was historically recent, specific to a narrow band of class and race, and even at its height, not universally lived. Take Elizabeth Maggie. In 1903, she filed a patent for a board game called The Landlord's Game. You might know it by its later name, Monopoly. She designed it to demonstrate the economic injustice of landlordism. She did this before women had the right to vote nationally, at a time when fewer than 1% of patent holders were women. She was not submitting to anybody. For decades, a man named Charles Darrow got the credit after he stole her original version, which is its own lesson in who stories get told. And then there's Nanny Doss, an American housewife in the 1940s and 50s, cheerful, grandmotherly, devoted to home and family, the quintessential tradwife. She was also a monstrous serial killer linked to at least 11 deaths, including 4 husbands and various immediate family members over several decades, which is possibly a niche offshoot of tradwives we've yet to see showcase their murderous skills on social media, but I'm sure we will in the due passage of time. She used the stereotype of the harmless housewife as active camouflage. Nobody looked twice at the smiling woman in the apron. Nobody ever does. Until you realise you're ingesting arsenic, then you might sleep with one eye open. When tradwife content tells you that submission and financial dependence is how things have always been, what they're describing is a very specific, very recent slice of Western history, approximately the 1950s American suburbs, populated almost exclusively by white upper-class wasps. This certainly was not the eternal default of human civilization. The historical record gives you Assyrian businesswomen on clay tablets 4,000 years ago, medieval Brewsters, Elizabeth Maggie filing a patent for a game about economic justice before women could vote. Women throughout history worked, argued, owned, and refused. The housewife wasn't traditional. She was an attempt at control during a period in time when people were sick of fighting. The tradwife trend is, in essence, nostalgia for something that was never quite real, dressed up as something ancient and inevitable, which is, academically speaking, absolute horseshit.
Okay, so that's doing a lot of heavy lifting for us, because what that shows is the idea of women being passive, domestic, and economically dependent is not some timeless universal truth. It's a very specific model from a very specific time, and more importantly, from a very specific group of people. And that distinction here matters a lot, because narratives about traditional life only work when we forget how recent and selective they actually are. Because one thing I want to expand on here is why that 1950s model became so dominant in the first place. It wasn't just cultural, it was economic. After World War II, especially in places like the United States, you had mass industrial growth, suburban expansion, and a push towards stability after years of global conflict. The nuclear family became a kind of idealized solution. You had one income supporting an entire household, which was actually possible for a lot of middle-class families at the time. But even then, it wasn't universal. Working class women were still working. Women of color were still working. And globally, this model didn't apply at all. So what we think of as traditional is actually recent, localized, and heavily influenced by class. And that's a very different picture than what the tradwife trend suggests. So if it's not historically accurate, why is it resonating? This is where it gets really interesting because I don't think this trend is actually about history. I think it's about the present, and more specifically, it's about burnout. For the last decade or so, we've been in what you could basically call peak hustle culture. The idea that you should always be productive, optimizing yourself, building something, monetizing your hobbies, and turning every part of your life into some kind of output. There was this constant pressure to be on all the time. And then the pandemic hit. And for a lot of people, that entire system just broke. Work and home stopped being separate things. Time became weird. Routines disappeared. And for a brief moment, there was this forced slowdown that a lot of people had not experienced in years. And what came out of that wasn't just stress. It was kind of a reevaluation. People started asking, do I actually want my life to look like this? Do I want to be busy forever? What am I even working towards? And in that space, anything that looked like simplicity started to feel appealing again. Not necessarily because it was realistic, but because it felt stable. So when you see content that offers a slower pace, predictable routines, clearly defined roles, and this idea of a quiet, contained life, it doesn't just look aesthetic, it looks like relief. And that tradwife trend fits directly into that emotional gap because it packages simplicity into something visual and consumable. Soft mornings, clean kitchens, homemade routines, structured days. It's not just a lifestyle, it's a fantasy of control in a world that feels increasingly unpredictable. But there's another layer here too, because the way we consume content has changed just as much as the culture that produces it. Post-pandemic, there was a noticeable rise in nostalgic content online. Not just tradwife content, but anything that felt slower, simpler, more authentic, or visually disconnected from modern chaos. And algorithms respond really well to that, because platforms are designed to prioritize what keeps people watching, not necessarily what reflects reality. So when content like this starts getting engagement, it gets amplified. It gets recommended more. It gets repeated in slightly different forms. And over time, it stops being just a niche aesthetic and becomes something you can't really avoid seeing. Which means the feeling of why is this everywhere isn't accidental. It's partially because people are feeling the same post-pandemic fatigue, but also because the systems we use to consume media are very good at identifying that feeling and feeding it back to us. And that combination is powerful because it makes a specific kind of lifestyle feel not only desirable, but inevitable. And when you combine all of that, burnout, post-pandemic slowdown, and algorithmic amplification, you get a situation where simplicity doesn't just feel appealing anymore. It starts to feel like the answer. And that's where things start to get complicated. Because once a lifestyle becomes a solution in people's minds, it's very easy to stop questioning what parts of it are actually real, which is where the aesthetic starts to take over. Because what you're seeing is not the full reality of that lifestyle. You're seeing the baking, the cleaning, the aesthetic moments. You're not seeing any financial stress, relationship dynamics, lack of independence, or long-term risk. And that gap between aesthetic and reality is really important because it turns something complex into something simple. And something simple is much easier to sell. And this is where I want to be very clear. There is nothing wrong with choosing a traditional lifestyle. If someone wants to stay home, raise a family, and structure their life that way, that's completely valid. That's not the issue. The issue is when that choice is presented as the natural default, the morally superior option, or the only correct way to live, because that shifts it from a personal decision into a social expectation. And historically, that's where things get complicated. One of the biggest concerns here is financial dependency, because when one person controls the income, the finances, the access to resources, that creates a power imbalance. And I want to be really precise about what that means. It doesn't automatically mean a relationship is unhealthy, but it does mean the person without income control has less leverage, fewer options, and a much harder exit ramp if something changes. And historically, this is not a hypothetical concern. It is something women had to actively fight for, because for a very long time, financial independence was not even legally available in the way we understand it today. For example, in the United States, until the 1970s, many women couldn't get a credit card in their own name without a husband or male cosigner. Banks would simply refuse, even if they had their own income, even if they were single. Credit was treated as something tied to a man, not an individual. That only began to change after laws like the Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974, which made it illegal to discriminate based on sex or marital status in lending decisions. And that shift matters because credit is not just about buying things. It's about mobility. It's about leaving unsafe situations. It's about starting over. So when we talk about financial independence today, we're not talking about abstract empowerment language. We're talking about very real structural protections that are actually quite recent. And that's why this conversation matters so much. Not because staying home is inherently wrong, but because dependency without choice removes safety nets that took decades to build. And this is where things get a bit more complicated than the internet usually allows, because it's just a personal choice only works if everyone has equal access to all the options. But history shows us that access is something that has been uneven, recently constructed, and sometimes reversible, which is why trends like this don't exist in a vacuum. They sit on top of systems that were actively fought for not that long ago. And this is also where we have to talk about something a bit more uncomfortable, because lifestyle content doesn't just stay lifestyle content, especially when it becomes large enough to turn into a cultural ideal. When one way of living is consistently framed as more natural, more moral, or more desirable, it doesn't just influence individuals, it influences expectations. And expectations eventually influence policy conversations. We've already seen in recent years major legal and political shifts in areas tied to bodily autonomy, family structure, and reproductive rights. For example, the overturning of Roe v. Wade in 2022 in the United States fundamentally changed access to abortion care across multiple states. And regardless of where someone stands politically, that kind of shift changes the practical reality of how people plan families, careers, and financial independence. So when you combine cultural nostalgia for traditional roles, economic pressure, pushing people towards stability narratives and political movements that emphasize returning to quote-unquote traditional values, you start to see how these things can reinforce each other over time. And again, this isn't me saying this trend causes policy changes. That would be too simplistic. But culture and politics don't exist separately. They feed into each other. And the question becomes less about individual choice and more about what happens when one version of life is repeatedly elevated as the ideal standard. And honestly, this is where I feel like I only scratched the surface, because we could also talk about how these trends are monetized, how influencer income complicates the stay-at-home narrative, and how some of this overlaps with broader political messaging online. But that might actually deserve its own video. So let me know if you want a part 2 where we go deeper into the political and economic machinery behind this trend, because there's a lot more under the hood here. At the end of the day, this isn't really about whether being a tradwife is good or bad. It's about how it's being presented and what gets left out of the frame. Because history shows us there has never been one single correct way to structure a household. And every time society has tried to narrow that down into one ideal model, it has usually left out more people than it includes. This isn't just a lifestyle trend. It's a narrative about how life should look. And the moment we start treating one narrative as the default, we stop noticing the others that exist alongside it. But you know what? I'd love to hear what you think. Do you see this trend as harmless, or do you think there's something deeper going on? Let me know in the comments. If you liked this video, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next video. I have a case study coming up next week that has been highly requested and is our first ever return to a subject, so you won't want to miss that. And also, let me know if you like the new hair, because I'm still processing it. It's not exactly the color I was expecting it to, but it's growing on me. It's growing on me. We'll get used to it. Anyway, I'll catch you guys in the next one. Bye!